On Halloween night, 21-year-old Chris Jenkins was kicked out of a downtown bar without his coat, wallet, or phone and disappeared into the cold night. 4 months later, his body was recovered from the Mississippi River. The first ruling was a drowning, and the manner was found to be undetermined, but the details didn't add up. For years, the family fought against the system, insisting that it was murder and not a tragic accident. Then, in 2006, everything was turned upside down by an informant when the case was reclassified as a homicide. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell before you go. I have been feeling a little bit under the weather, so I'm sorry in advance if my voice is kind of scratchy. All right, friends, let's get into today's case. Chris Jenkins was a 21-year-old senior at the University of Minnesota. He was born on February 17, 1981, and grew up in Minneapolis in the suburb called Eden Prairie with his parents Steve and Jan Jenkins and his sister Sarah. Chris was bright, friendly, and full of life. He excelled in academics as a business major at the Carlson School of Management, and he was also the captain and goalie of the university's lacrosse team. He was so passionate about the sport. Friends and family also shared that his sense of humor and ability to make people laugh was like no other. In the fall of 2002, Chris was just months away from graduation. He had job interviews lined up and a promising future ahead of him. He was the fourth family member to attend the University of Minnesota, following in the footsteps of both his parents and his sister. I love that they had that family tradition. Chris was responsible, upbeat, and not the type of person to ever really engage in any risky behaviors typically. He was very intentional and practical, and I say these things now because they will come up later. Chris was living in Minneapolis and dating a fellow student named Ashley Rice, who was his girlfriend at the time. Halloween 2002 fell on a Thursday, and like many other college students, Chris and his friends made plans to go out and celebrate that night. The city's downtown area was very busy, and everyone was dressed up in Halloween costumes. Chris dressed up in Native American attire, including a brown nylon shirt and pants, a headband with a single red feather, and moccasins. Something important to point out is that he didn't have any pockets, meaning he had to leave all of his essentials, like his wallet and phone, with his friends or in the car. On October 31st, 2002, Chris, Ashley, and a few other friends kicked off the evening at a keg party at Chris's apartment around 6 p.m. Around 10:30 or 11, the group then decided to go downtown to Minneapolis to continue the Halloween party at Lone Tree Bar and Grill, which is a really popular bar on Hennepin Avenue. They parked their car just south of the bar and then went inside to continue the celebrations. For a while, the Halloween party at the Lone Tree Bar was going well. Chris was seen inside having a good time and having drinks with everybody, and at some point close to midnight, however, things took a turn. Chris Jenkins was reportedly kicked out of the bar around midnight. Witnesses later said that the Lone Tree security manager instructed staff not to let Chris back in after an incident happened. It's been speculated that Chris accidentally spilled a drink or maybe got into a minor fight with somebody at the bar, which happens in the bar settings, but for whatever reason, the bouncers escorted him out into the chilly night and refused to let him back inside. This was Minnesota in late October, and temperatures were around 20 degrees Fahrenheit or -6 degrees Celsius. Chris didn't have his coat with him because he'd left it with his friends, along with his wallet, keys, and cell phone. A bouncer saw Chris walk away from the bar, turning left, so north onto Hennepin Avenue around midnight. That was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. He was alone, underdressed for the weather, and intoxicated. His friends, including his girlfriend Ashley, apparently didn't even realize that he had been kicked out because they were still inside, assuming that he'd be coming back. By the time that they figured out that he was gone, it was too late. In a matter of just minutes, on a night filled with celebration and Halloween partying, Chris Jenkins had vanished. I have to say that I personally find this part very strange because there was no action taken that night after Chris left. If my husband and I were out with our friends and he was kicked out, I would have left with him. And if he were gone before I realized, I would have gone looking for him immediately. Let me know if you guys find this strange too. So did security overreact or maybe mistake him for someone else? Those questions were unanswered, but what is known is that the consequences were dire. The Jenkins family were also concerned because 2 off-duty Minneapolis police officers were reportedly also at the bar that night. According to Jan Jenkins, one of those off-duty cops had even lent parts of his uniform to Chris's girlfriend Ashley to wear as a last-minute Halloween costume that night, and he was talking to the head bouncer shortly before Chris was kicked out. Jan wondered if the police officer maybe played a role in Chris being removed, possibly because he was interested in Ashley and wanted Chris out of the way. What is certain is that after midnight on November 1st, 2002, Chris Jenkins was gone. When he failed to meet up with his friends later and didn't return home, alarm bells immediately began to ring. By the next morning, everyone knew that something had to be wrong. Chris was responsible and always kept in touch. He wouldn't just run off without contacting anyone, and he had left his keys and wallet behind, meaning he had no way to drive, communicate, or buy anything. The Jenkins family reported him missing to Minneapolis police and immediately drove from their home to help find their son. Chris's family and friends started a massive search effort. They plastered the city with missing person flyers showing Chris's smiling face and costume description. Jan and Steve Jenkins stood in front of crowds at the University of Minnesota pleading for help. On November 6, 2002, they held a vigil and rally at the university's Northrop Plaza. Jan tearfully said to the media, "Someone knows something. Would you please do the right thing and step forward?" The Minneapolis police, however, were not convinced that anything nefarious had happened at all. From their perspective, it's common for adults to go missing for a short period of time, especially after a night out of drinking, and police reportedly told the Jenkins family that Chris might have gone off to sow his oats or sleep it off somewhere. This dismissive attitude deeply frustrated the family. They knew that Chris would never go out and do something like this voluntarily, and as the days passed with no word from him, the situation looked increasingly worse. Despite the lack of immediate action from the police, the Jenkins family refused to sit by and watch. They immediately hired a private investigator named Chuck Loesch within days of Chris's disappearance. Loesch was an ex-police officer and quickly became invaluable in gathering clues that others had been overlooking. Together, the family and Loesch started piecing together Chris's last known movements and anything that might have happened outside the bar that night. One early tip came from a random pedestrian. Someone thought that they saw a person matching Chris's description walking north across Hennepin Avenue Bridge shortly after midnight. Since the bridge is just a few blocks from the Lone Tree Bar, it seemed possible. Maybe Chris, since he was unable to get back inside the bar, decided to walk across the Mississippi River towards the direction of his apartment. Steve and Jan Jenkins pressed for any surveillance footage all along that path that could possibly confirm what the pedestrian had told them. The Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, which is located near the Hennepin Avenue Bridge, had tons of security cameras on that specific portion of the bridge. Side note, but this was actually shortly after 9/11, and security cameras in that area were good quality after increasing security measures from what was going on in the world at that time. The family managed to get those tapes reviewed, but sadly the footage did not show Chris or anyone in his costume crossing the bridge that night. In fact, an FBI analysis later determined that it would almost be impossible for someone to travel over that bridge unseen given the thorough camera coverage. This suggested that the tip was likely mistaken or that maybe Chris did head towards the bridge, but he never actually made it across. Meanwhile, Loesch uncovered reports of a disturbance around the time that Chris went missing. Several witnesses came forward saying that they saw a group of about 10 young men in a fight near Times Square Pizza, which is directly across the street from the Lone Tree Bar. It was rumored to be some kind of gang initiation where a random person gets attacked by a group of men. The timing was somewhat unclear, but some witnesses did put it in the general window of around midnight, which aligns perfectly for when Chris was on that block. Could Chris have been the victim of their attack? To investigate this potential lead, the Jenkins family brought in specialized resources. They deployed 2 trained bloodhounds on separate searches days apart, each with different handlers to ensure accurate results too. Both bloodhounds picked up on Chris's scent on the sidewalk in front of Times Square Pizza, exactly where the witnesses had said that the fight took place. Both dogs then followed scent trails to the parking garage next to the pizza shop. They led handlers up to the same specific parking space inside that garage, then abruptly lost trail. This discovery raised the hairs on the back of the searchers' necks. This meant that Chris might have been attacked and then taken away in a vehicle parked in that garage. Supporting that theory were some additional clues. There were drops of blood and a red feather found in that exact parking spot. The feather could have come from Chris's red feather headband. All of this information, the altercation, the scent trail, the feather, and the blood pointed towards foul play. The Jenkins family was certain that these were all critical clues. However, they had difficulties convincing the authorities. While the family and volunteers searched all over Minneapolis for any sign of Chris, the story made its way to the headlines. Chris was one of 4 young people to go missing in the upper Midwest in a span of just 10 days in 2002. Media outlets ran stories about a potential pattern because all were about college age, last seen at bars or parties, and vanished at night. This fueled a lot of speculation about a potential serial predator. Chris's father, Steve, said to the media, "There are too many similarities. Brilliant kids, high achievers, all about the same height and weight and time frame." Families of the missing people got together, hoping that a common thread between them might lead to some answers. Minneapolis police publicly stated that they did not see a link between these cases at that time, though. Each investigation proceeded separately. For Chris, despite the family's mounting evidence of foul play, there was still no sign of him, not a phone call, no credit card usage, or confirmed sightings in the days and weeks following Halloween. Minneapolis's downtown area, including the Mississippi riverfront, were searched repeatedly by volunteers. The family even ventured into sometimes dangerous territory, like using psychics out of pure desperation to find their son. Nearly 4 months passed with no progress. Then, on February 27, 2003, the mystery took a tragic turn. That afternoon, 2 pedestrians walking across the 3rd Avenue Bridge in downtown Minneapolis spotted something unusual caught in the debris in the Mississippi River down below. It was the outline of a body in dark clothing floating just beneath the surface and snagged on some logs. Authorities were called, and Minneapolis police and fire arrived to recover the body somewhere between 4 to 6 p.m. that day. The location was between the Hennepin Avenue Bridge and the 3rd Avenue Bridge near the St. Anthony Falls Hydroelectric Lab. The remains were found floating on the back with arms in front. The body was badly decomposed, having clearly been in the water for an extended period of time. Some critical identifiers were still intact, though. The person was wearing leather or faux leather pants and leggings as part of a Native American-style costume. The body was taken to Hennepin County Medical Examiner's office, and that evening, the Jenkins family got the devastating news. Private investigator Chuck Loesch received a call from Steve Jenkins at about 8:30 p.m., telling him that a body had been found, and it was almost certainly Chris. Loesch later said that Steve was just destroyed, and his wife Jan was even worse. "I cannot imagine the pain that they were in after fighting so hard to find their son." After 4 months of agonizing uncertainty, the Jenkins family finally had the answer as to where Chris was, but now they faced an even harder question of what happened to him. On February 28, 2003, dental records confirmed that the body was Christopher Mark Jenkins. From the beginning, police officials seemed to view this as either an accident or that he had done this to himself. The body's location and condition fit the profile of a drowning. A young man, last seen drunk near the river, found after drowning. The working theory was that Chris was in an impaired state and upset because there were rumors that he had argued with Ashley that night, so he may have made his way to the bridge and fallen into the river on his own. How would this not have been captured on camera, though? The Jenkins family saw signs that challenged the drowning narrative immediately. For one, volunteers had combed areas of the riverbank earlier in the search and had not found Chris's body at that time. Yet here he was, discovered in a spot not far from where he disappeared, and this area was thoroughly checked. This immediately raised this unsettling possibility that Chris's body was placed in the river at a later time rather than having been there since Halloween. The state of Chris's remains and clothing also provided some clues. The water temperature on the day of recovery was 33 degrees Fahrenheit, so just above freezing, and the air was about 35 degrees. The cold water likely slowed decomposition, which may have contributed to the body being relatively intact with the clothing and shoes still on. It may have even caused partial freezing of tissues because one of the people that discovered the body said Chris was partially frozen in some ice when he was found. This is a morbid thought, but many wondered if the body had actually been kept on ice in storage by someone, then later dumped in the river. Chris was still wearing his slip-on shoes and his clothes. His brown shirt was still even tucked into his pants. And in drowning cases, this is unusual because a person flailing in the water usually loses their shoes or maybe one of them and ends up face down with their clothing messed up or partially removed. Chris was found floating on his back with his arms crossed over his chest, shoes on, and outfit perfectly intact. It almost looked as if he had been placed in the water deliberately, in a composed state, or that he was already gone when he entered the water. Clutched in one of Chris's own hands were a few strands of hair. Initially, nobody realized this. It was only when the Jenkins family obtained and reviewed autopsy photos and pushed for more analysis that this was discovered. These parents are so observant and they advocated so well for their son. Could you imagine finding something like this that the investigators or ME missed? In 2006, forensic tests identified the hair as Chris's own, but this could indicate that he maybe yanked out his own hair in agony or maybe even pain before his death. 3 medical examiners, including Dr. Peterson and 2 others, conducted Chris's autopsy. Jan Jenkins said that they were the best of the best. The family even requested a second opinion from a Milwaukee medical examiner as a consultant in order just to review the findings to make sure that whatever those 3 found was accurate. The autopsy had to answer a critical question. Was there any evidence that Chris died by something other than drowning? External and internal exams were done first. The medical examiners noted no obvious signs of severe trauma, meaning no gunshot wounds, stab wounds, or any broken bones that were apparent on the body. This seemed to rule out some causes of death, but it didn't definitively rule out foul play yet. If Chris had been strangled or suffocated, the signs could be subtle or erased by decomposition. They also found some marks that were ambiguous. There were some dark areas on the skin that could have been bruises or could have also been natural decomposition. It was hard to tell given the conditions of the remains, though. Microscopic examinations of tissues were done by preserving and analyzing sections of organs for any abnormalities or diseases. If Chris had any underlying health issues or had suffered something like a myocardial infarction, which, if you didn't know, that's a heart attack, that might be detectable microscopically, but there was nothing to support that whatsoever. A key part of the autopsy was also the toxicology report, but it was significantly impaired by the circumstances. By the time Chris's body was found, there was nearly no blood or urine left to sample because these fluids had either decomposed so badly or they mixed with the environment after being in the water for so long. The pathologists instead had to rely on deep tissue samples, like from the liver, muscle, or heart, to test for these substances. One result that came back was Chris's approximate BAC or blood alcohol concentration. It was measured at 0.12% from the tissue in his heart and 0.07% from other muscles. These levels suggest that Chris was intoxicated, but not to a dangerous level. I know that we say this a lot, but legal driving limit is 0.08%, so 0.12% is the equivalent of about 5 or 6 drinks in the system. However, experts felt that these postmortem readings could be inaccurate. As bodies decompose, especially in the water, bacterial processes can produce ethanol or alcohol and alter these levels. This means that 0.12% might overestimate or even underestimate his actual levels on Halloween, so it's really hard to tell. After weeks of meticulous work, the autopsy results were finalized and given to the family in May of 2003. The cause of death was officially listed as drowning, meaning death by submersion in liquid, but the manner of death was left undetermined. In other words, the medical examiners could not say whether Chris's drowning was accidental, self-induced, or homicidal. Don't go yet, though, because there are some major updates to come. The Jenkins family members were frustrated by the lack of answers from the autopsy, and they wanted something more definitive than undetermined, and we see this pretty often. Anybody would want a clear answer. Minneapolis police leaned towards a tragic but non-criminal explanation for Chris's death, though. From their perspective, all signs pointed directly to an accident. The cause of death was drowning, Chris had been drinking heavily, and there was a plausible scenario. Maybe he was disoriented by the alcohol, and because of the shock from being out in the cold, he wandered towards the river. A piece of information that became public was that Chris and Ashley did have a minor argument at the bar that night. That was enough to feel that Chris might have been upset when he left, so he went to the bridge and either jumped or fell. Before we continue on in today's case, though, knowing what we already know, do you feel like this is a plausible theory? Let me know in the comments. By mid-2003, the case was losing momentum within the police department. The investigating officers found no eyewitnesses to any assault, and the physical evidence that was gathered by the family, like the blood droplets and the feather in the garage, had not been verified by the police department. From law enforcement's perspective, unless someone came forward with an absolute confession or solid evidence of an assault, the simplest explanation was usually the correct one: an accident. In 2004, the Minneapolis Police Department made a decision that devastated the Jenkins family. They closed the case, labeling it an unsolved accidental or undetermined death. The Jenkins family challenged the police's conclusion. From day one, Steve and Jan Jenkins said that they believed Chris was the victim of foul play. Now with the case closed, it felt to them like the system was abandoning their son for the second time. They held press conferences and gave interviews criticizing the investigation, and Jan described it as sloppy and incompetent at best, which just shows you the level of frustration that they were all feeling. During 2003 and 2004, the Jenkins family became the primary investigators of their own son's death, including recruiting psychics, which I touched on earlier, volunteers, and experts. Forensic expert Dr. Michael Baden, who was a former New York City chief medical examiner, was known for high-profile cases and was asked to review this case. Baden looked at the autopsy pictures and the circumstances and also agreed that things didn't line up with an accidental drowning. Hydrologists and engineers from the University of Minnesota St. Anthony Falls Laboratory were consulted to analyze river currents and where a body entering at various points would end up. This was important because if Chris had gone into the river on Halloween night, there's still no explanation as to how his body traveled or remained hidden until late February. According to Jan, those experts told them that certain aspects like backwater currents near the river's islands didn't match a body floating freely from a high bridge drop to where Chris was found. In other words, if he had fallen from that Hennepin Avenue bridge into the main channel, they expected a completely different outcome in terms of where and how quickly his body would have been discovered. On May 18, 2003, on what should have been Chris's graduation day, the University of Minnesota awarded him a bachelor's degree in marketing and entrepreneurial management. In a ceremony at the Carlson School of Management, his sister Sarah walked across the stage to accept Chris's diploma. This was a reminder of the life that Chris had built, and it was powerful. The auditorium filled with applause and tears, and this was a bright light for the family during their darkest days and a way to honor Chris's hard work and potential. Still, the question of what exactly happened to their child on Halloween in 2002 remained unanswered. The Minneapolis police may have closed their file in 2004, but Steve and Jan Jenkins kept the investigation alive on their own dime and time. They urged anyone with knowledge to come forward. Their persistence paid off when they caught the attention of Minneapolis Police Lieutenant Tim Dolan, who then became the new chief of police in early 2006. The Jenkins family met with Dolan and shared Loesch's extensive investigative findings, including all the pictures, timelines, expert analyses, and even names of persons of interest. According to Chuck Loesch, when Dolan saw the sheer amount of evidence and inconsistencies that they had gathered, he agreed that the case required another look. This was a major turning point. After years of being brushed off, the family had finally persuaded someone at the top of the police department to take them seriously. While the Jenkins family was moving heaven and earth on their own, a quiet development was also happening within the Minneapolis Police Department. Sergeant Patrick Pete Jackson, who was a homicide investigator, had never fully let go of Chris's file. Jackson was not originally the lead detective in 2002 because it wasn't classified as a homicide then, if you remember, but something about this case just stuck with him. In 2005, Jackson caught wind of a rumor that had been circulating among inmates and street informants, which he described as a 10th-hand rumor because it had been passed through so many people and eventually made its way back to him. But Jackson decided to trace this rumor back to its originating source to see where it went. It took him on a wild goose chase across multiple state lines, and he said that he conducted several interviews across the country to verify different parts of this story. Bit by bit, a narrative emerged that aligned eerily with what the Jenkins family had suspected all along. By late 2005, Jackson had identified and located a man who claimed to have firsthand knowledge of how Chris Jenkins died. This individual was incarcerated in another state on unrelated charges, but what he revealed broke the case wide open. According to this witness, whose name has never been released, Halloween night in 2002 did not end for Chris Jenkins by accident. It ended in a violent act of murder. The man confessed that he and another individual had ran into Chris that night. He described seeing Chris on or near Hennepin Avenue Bridge's pedestrian walkway after Chris left the bar, and the witness described Chris as an easy target because he was visibly drunk and alone. Their plan was to mug him. The witness said that they approached Chris to rob him, but when they demanded his money or wallet, Chris had nothing to give them since his wallet was left at the bar and his costume had no pockets. They searched him and found nothing valuable. At that point, things turned deadly. His accomplice flew into a rage over the robbery gone wrong. The accomplice then allegedly grabbed Chris and threw him over the railing of the bridge down into the Mississippi River. It was a cold-blooded murder followed by a failed theft attempt. The witness did not share exactly what role he played in it or what he did afterwards, but this story offered a concrete scenario with a motive and method that fit the known timeline. It also potentially explained why Chris's wallet and phone were still back with his friends and how this would complicate the robbery. With this new testimony, Sergeant Jackson had what he needed to reopen the case as a homicide investigation. Chief Tim Dolan, who had already been working with Jan and Steve, was now presented with internal evidence that corroborated what the family had been fighting for all along. In early 2006, Dolan gave the green light to officially reclassify Chris Jenkins' case as a homicide and assigned homicide detectives to actively begin working on it. For the Jenkins family, this was both validating and a gut punch. On November 17, 2006, nearly 4 years to the day that Chris was last seen, Steve and Jan Jenkins were invited to sit down with Sergeant Pete Jackson, another homicide officer, and a medical examiner. It was in this meeting that Jackson told them directly that their son was, in fact, a victim of homicide. These were the words that Jenkins' family had been waiting to hear for so long, as an acknowledgement of what they already knew in their hearts. Jan wrote that it was a strange feeling to feel a sense of relief upon hearing that her son was murdered, but that's because it validated their 4-year fight. It meant that the system finally believed them, and their son's death would be treated with the gravity it deserved. So, on November 20th, 2006, Minneapolis Police Chief Tim Dolan held a press conference that marked an extraordinary turning point in the Chris Jenkins case. Dolan announced that Chris Jenkins' death was no longer considered accidental or undetermined, but that now it would be classified as a homicide. In doing so, he addressed the elephant in the room that the initial investigation had failed to get it right. Chief Dolan said, quote, "We made a mistake. We made an assumption. We caused pain in the Jenkins family, and for that, the Minneapolis Police Department and I want to apologize directly to the Jenkins family," end quote. It's not often that a police chief will openly admit an error in classifying a death, but Dolan seemed to genuinely be empathetic towards the family for all that they had endured, and he promised to make things right under his leadership. Sergeant Pete Jackson shared at the press conference that a credible eyewitness had come forward and that this witness provided information that Chris was thrown from a bridge. Jan and Steve publicly shared their doubts that Chris was actually thrown off the Hennepin Avenue Bridge, though, despite what the witness said, because he still had his shoes on and his shirt was tucked in. Also, his arms were found crossed, which could happen, I guess, by chance, but it struck them as more consistent with a body being placed there, maybe even ritualistically, rather than being flung off of a bridge in a struggle. In her book, Jan hinted at possible satanic rituals being involved too, especially with this falling on Halloween. This was influenced by some of the more bizarre tips that she'd gotten over the years. Some speculated about occult symbols or dates because of the Halloween timing, and the number 13 being reversed as 31. Jan's suggestion of ritual elements was not backed by any hard evidence, but it reflected that this may have been more than just a random mugging. She and Steve believed one or more of the killers are still out there, maybe even in their own community, and that the motive might be deeper than robbery, like an initiation or thrill kill of some type. Some of the original officers who had worked or not worked on Chris's case back in 2002 to 2003 declined to comment publicly after the homicide announcement. Off the record, a few said that they often see families grasping at straws and falling for bizarre theories when they can't accept that a loved one's death was an accident. One officer involved said that families are psychologically prone to prefer believing in murder over a random accident because they have someone else to blame. That seems so insensitive to say given the situation, though, don't you think? With the case being reopened and reclassified, the Minneapolis Police Department had a lot of work to do. The focus in late 2006 and early 2007 was on building a prosecutable case. That meant tracking down the second suspect and corroborating the informant story by evidence. By early 2007, Minneapolis police investigators honed in on a suspect in Chris Jenkins' murder, and this was the person whom the jailhouse informant had accused of actually throwing Chris over the bridge. That suspect was a man who had been present in downtown Minneapolis that night, Jeremy Lynn Alford. Alford was a known criminal with a disturbingly violent history. He was 22 years old in 2002, and it turned out that he was at the Lone Tree Bar on Halloween, placing him at the scene of Chris's disappearance. In 2005, so just a few years later, Alford was then arrested and convicted of a brutal murder in Iowa. Along with his 17-year-old brother Luis, he killed a roommate named Douglas Miller by beating, stabbing, and even burning the victim before dumping him in a river. By 2007, Jeremy Alford had been sentenced to life in prison for that crime, and we see a theme of dumping victims in water here too. Alford and his brother were known to bounce between Minnesota and Iowa. They were a part of a really rough crowd, and police in their Iowa hometown described the Alford brothers as major troublemakers, and they were very familiar with law enforcement. Let me know down in the comments if you feel like the victims being placed in the water could be a potential pattern too. Either way, it's not hard to see why Alford became a suspect. He matched the profile of someone that was capable of doing something like this. He was at the same bar as Chris, and he ended up committing an arguably even more violent crime later on. Now, linking Alford to Chris's murder in court was a whole other issue. In mid-2007, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office reviewed the evidence against the suspect and determined that there was insufficient evidence to charge him. This was announced around July 2007, 6 months after the case was reopened. After Chris Jenkins' death was reclassified as a homicide, investigators believed that they were close to answers, but prosecutors ultimately declined to file charges against Alford. The evidence hinged mainly on the testimony of a jailhouse informant who implicated an already convicted killer, Jeremy Alford, and this was a problematic source given the lack of any physical evidence. There were no fingerprints, DNA, surveillance footage, or any definitive forensic links, making it difficult to build a case with reasonable likelihood of conviction. That phrase came straight from the prosecutor. Alford refused to cooperate when questioned about Jenkins. Later in 2008, he told the FBI agents a bizarre story about a gang called the Dealers of Death, or DOD, who were allegedly responsible for dozens of murders of young men, and this group was led by someone called Smiley, so Smiley with a Z. The FBI found no proof that this gang even existed, but some of Alford's associates confirmed the name and claimed that Alford bragged about killing a college student in a Native American costume, which eerily resembled Jenkins' case. One witness quoted Alford saying, "I killed this stupid-looking dude and threw him over the bridge." Despite those statements, authorities were skeptical about this DOD group. Despite all of this, private investigator Chuck Loesch and the Jenkins family questioned the theory that Chris was thrown off of the Hennepin Avenue Bridge for several reasons. Alford was tall at about 6'4", but skinny at 180 pounds, and Chris was 5'8", but was strong and athletic at 180 pounds. Could Alford single-handedly lift and hurl a man of equal weight over a high railing? It's not impossible, but Loesch thought that it would be extremely difficult without help, especially if Chris resisted. The Federal Reserve Bank's cameras didn't show any commotion on the Hennepin Avenue Bridge at that time, and the bridge is usually well lit and has a lot of traffic late at night, and nobody reported seeing a man being thrown over. It's the kind of thing where someone might notice and call 911, but no calls came in. The autopsy found no broken bones or massive injuries that roughly a 100-foot fall should cause. If Chris had been conscious and struggling, you should also expect defensive wounds or other marks, which there weren't any clearly present, but remember, decomposition may have obscured some of that evidence. Experts told the family that if someone was thrown over the bridge and hit the water with force, loose-fitting shoes like Chris's slip-on clogs would likely come off during that impact or during a prolonged period of time in the water. Chris's shoes were both on his feet, which hints that he might have entered the water more gently or was already deceased. They believed that Chris was abducted somewhere else, killed, and later placed into the river. Without any new evidence, the case remained open but inactive from 2007 onward, though. Alford remains the prime suspect, but no charges were ever brought against him. The Jenkins family, especially Chris's parents, Steve and Jan Jenkins, became vocal advocates for justice reform and awareness about their son's case. Jan wrote a book called Footprints of Courage in 2009, sharing about their painful journey and all of the difficulties that they faced getting the authorities to take this case seriously. She also called out disparities in how missing young men's cases are investigated differently compared to women's. The family established scholarships, spoke about campus safety, and urged students to look out for one another, especially during nights out. Chris is remembered as a bright, athletic, funny, and hardworking young man. He had so much love for life, and there's just no reason why he shouldn't still be here. Over 20 years later, the murder remains unsolved. While Alford is in prison for life for other charges, no one else has been held accountable for Chris Jenkins' death. The Jenkins family, now living in Colorado, continue to hope for new leads and encourage anyone with information to please come forward. I will put that information in the description box down below. Jan and Steve are some of the hardest working parents I have ever seen in the true crime community. My heart aches for them, and I pray that they get the answers that they have fought so hard for. Thank you all for watching and listening to Chris Jenkins' story today. Today is our final video in our Halloween series, and I wanted to end it here as a reminder to please be careful while celebrating Halloween this week and or weekend. Make sure to let your friends and family know where you are. Have a designated driver if you're going to be going out or drinking, and please keep your phone on you. Today's tragic case didn't need to end in this way, and Chris's parents have continued to advocate for stronger safety measures when going out, so I am sending you my love and asking you to please do the same. But of course, also enjoy it and have fun. Also, since our last video, we hit 10,000 subscribers. I cannot believe that you're all here with me, and for those of you that come week after week, I can't express to you how much each of you mean to me. We're building the most special little community over here, and I am so honored that we're in it together. That's all I can say without crying, so I'll end it there for now. Please be sure to take extra great care of yourselves this week. Nurse's orders, and have a great Halloween if you celebrate. I'll see you guys next weekend. Bye.